Hi, guess who's back? It's me. Apologies for the long absence, but hopefully none of you were on tenterhooks. But now I've read one of the biggest classics around, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas père, and I simply had to share my thoughts with you. So, welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host, Jules, and apparently it took a massive classic to get me back into recording this podcast. And really, I started reading The Count of Monte Cristo out of a sense of desperation. I think I just had a really big project at work finish, and I was projectless, and my brain started spinning out, and I thought, you know what is the best thing to do? Start a project that feels low stakes. And therefore, I bought a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. I didn't think I was going to read it as quickly as I did. It took me a couple of weeks, about a month and a bit. I also didn't think I was going to quite enjoy it as much. And after those almost 1,300 pages, I had a lot of thoughts. And not everyone in my actual real life wants to hear all of those. So I'm going to now make it your problem. You're welcome or my apologies, depending on what applies. So what I want to do today is, well, first I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the book and on Dumas himself, and then we're going to get into the plot. I went back and forth quite a bit on how much of the plot to share with you, because as I said, this book is almost 1,300 pages. If you've ever seen it, you know that it's like a door stopper. If I was going to recap all of it faithfully, we would be here for hours, and I don't think you would fully enjoy that. Admittedly, if you want a full recap, do let me know. But I don't think you want that, because the joy is actually in discovering where Dumas takes us. So what I'm going to do is the first, 300 odd pages, I'm going to be somewhat faithful and recap it properly, because that is what we all think we know about The Count of Monte Cristo. The 900 pages that follow are bonkers. They're great fun. And honestly, the less you know about it, the more fun it is. Because we are on a mission of revenge. We are plotting, we are tricking, we're showing different faces, we're wearing disguises and masks. And maybe at one point our thirst for revenge will be thwarted by genuine love and affection. Who knows? So that's what we're going to do today. And let's just get into it. So, a bit more about the book. Let's start there. So, this book, like many of the sort of bigger classics from the 19th century, I would say, was serialized. And Alexandre Dumas decided to go mildly mad in 1844, and he started his two biggest, or perhaps most well-known works in March of 1844. He started writing or serializing The Three Musketeers, which I have not yet read, and then in August, The Count of Monte Cristo. When I read this, I was like, how? Why? But also especially, how? And then I realized that actually Alexandre Dumas had something of a collaborator, perhaps not necessarily a co-writer, but someone who helped him plot out, find inspiration, etc. And this was Auguste Maquet, who he met in 1840. So together they plotted out these two stories so that Dumas could write them. And I found this very interesting that he had this collaborator who I'd never heard of before, because Maquet is nowhere on the byline, for example. Just as a heads up, I'm getting all of this information from the notes and introduction to the Penguin Classics edition that Robin Buss wrote alongside translating the book. That's a super useful resource that I can definitely recommend. So that's where this information is coming from. So, in 1844, they started serializing The Count of Monte Cristo in the Journal des Débats. I can only apologize for my French pronunciation, but I truly am trying. They serialized this until January 1846, when the story was finished. So it took about, let's say a solid year and a half at the very least. And By 1846, there was also already multiple 18-volume editions of the story that had come out. But it wasn't just in France that people loved this story, and it was very quickly translated into a whole number of languages. So by the time we hit the 20th century, let's say, we had English, Danish, Swedish, Italian, Spanish, Norwegian, and German translations. There were also already stage adaptations of The Count of Monte Cristo, some of which Dumas and Maquette themselves were involved in. It was a massively popular story that was read widely and wildly. People were really into it, and it's never really been out of print. Now, one thing that Robin Buss mentions in his introduction is that part of the reason The Count of Monte Cristo was so widely adapted and adjusted was that there was a specific moment in literature, let's say European literature, at this sort of halfway point of the 19th century, and that was a sort of rise of realism in fiction in contrast to something like popular fiction, which was melodramatic and gothic. And for those of you who've read, for example, anything by George Eliot, which is also the example Buss mentions, Middlemarch, Mill on the Floss, while those are dramatic texts and emotional texts, they're also very realist. And if you contrast that to something like The Count of Monte Cristo, which is lavish and sumptuous and over the top, you can kind of see the two different fronts that were going on. And I think the word that Buss uses is sacred when it comes to certain texts that are kept as they are, that sort of have their definitive version and are not altered because they're a great work of literature with capital G, F, and W. The Count of Monte Cristo was not that. It was considered popular and therefore it could be adjusted and changed. And a lot of these changes also happened when it was translated into English during the Victorian period. They removed a number of aspects that they thought were just not good for the ears of Victorian, or eyes of Victorian readers, ears of Victorian listeners. For example, The Count of Monte Cristo is very fond of hashish. They cut that out. And there are definitely some lesbian overtones with one of the characters towards the sort of end, the final third of the novel, I'd say. And apparently they cut some of that out as well. So the book was very popular. It's been in print ever since it was first serialized. And it is one of the great works of Alexandre Dumas' life. So let's look a little bit at his life. Alexandre Dumas is usually known, well, the one that we're talking about today, is usually known as Dumas Père. And that is because he had a son, an illegitimate one, called Alexandre Dumas as well. And he also wrote texts and books. So he is known as Alexandre Fils, which is son in French, whereas the Alexandre Dumas we're talking about today is called Père, father, in order to differentiate between the two. So our Alexandre Dumas Père was born in 1802. His father was Thomas Alexandre Dumas. He was an illegitimate son of a French marquis, and Marie Cécette Dumas, who was an enslaved Afro-Caribbean woman. And if I'm not wrong, the father, so Thomas Alexandre Dumas, was born in Haiti. In 1806, Thomas Alexandre dies, and it leaves Alexandre Dumas and his mother, Elisabeth Labouret, penniless. So they don't have any money, they don't have a whole lot of prospects, and so he starts writing dramas and getting involved in the literary scene in 1822. In 1824, he then has his illegitimate son, Alexandre Dumas Fils. But during his life, he writes a lot, and of course then in 1844 he begins his two big stories, but he travels through Italy and Spain, Northern Africa, etc., and he lives this very sort of international life, I would say. In 1850, however, he goes bankrupt, which is not ideal, and then in 1851, Louis Napoleon takes over the throne, or does a little coup. The French Republic comes to an end and the Second Empire is declared a year later. And Alexandre Dumas Père goes into exile in Belgium, as does another famous French writer of the time, Victor Hugo. He does continue to write during this period. He also continues to travel a little bit. This man was also very fond of having affairs, so he manages to squeeze another one in before the end of his life, which is in 1870, when he dies in Belgium. So this was a man who travelled around a lot. He had a lot of international contacts. He was very in touch with cultural and artistic scenes. And all of that experience of travelling, falling in love with different countries and regions definitely comes to the forefront in The Count of Monte Cristo. There is a big episode about, let's say, the second third of the novel, which takes place in Rome and in Italy. And you can really tell that Alexandre Dumas was in love with Italy. It comes so alive, and he describes sort of a festival there, and there's just so many details, and you can tell that this is a man who knew what was happening. Simultaneously, this book is also very much affected by Napoleon, by the Restoration, by the Second Empire, by accusations of Bonapartism, and we're going to get into that a little bit when I dive into the plot with you. But there's definitely a political undertone to this novel as well, which I think reflects probably some of Alexandre Dumas' own political inclinations. I'm perhaps not super surprised that he decided to go into exile rather than stay in the Second Empire. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of the book, its publication history, and Alexandre Dumas himself. So let's dive into the plot. I'm only going to recap the first few chapters in some detail so that you get a sense of it, and then I'm going to broadly, non-spoilery, indicate where the rest of the book goes. Let me start you off with the first line of the first chapter, or maybe the first 2 or 3 lines. Again, this is from Robin Buss's translation. Chapter 1, Marseille Arrival. On February 24th, 1815, the lookout at Notre-Dame de la Garde signaled the arrival of the 3-master Pharaon, coming from Smyrna, Trieste, and Naples. As usual, a coastal pilot immediately left the port, sailed hard by the Chateau d'If, and boarded the ship between the Cap de Morgiou and the island of Riou. At once, as was also customary, the terrace of Fort Saint-Jean was thronged with onlookers, because the arrival of a ship is always a great event in Marseille, particularly when the vessel, like the Pharaon, had been built, fitted out, and laded in the shipyards of the old port, and belongs to an owner from the town. So, that is our beginning, and initially I was like, oof, how much of this book is going to be about ships? And there's quite a couple of ships. But what I like is that it immediately gives us a bit of an indication of the scene. We have this port town, Marseille, which is a beautiful city, and it is full of people, and the arrival of the ship is a big deal. So we're in 1815, and the ship, the Pharaon, arrives. And aboard this ship, we meet a young, handsome man who was until recently a boy, and that is, of course, our protagonist, Edmond Dantes. He is described as being sort of calm, and he's really grown into himself. He's an excellent sailor. The people aboard the ship listen to him and respect him. And we find out all of this because the owner, who was just hinted at in the opening, Monsieur Morel, comes to the ship and he's like, please tell me that there's a good reason as to why you're late and that we still have all of our cargo. And Dantes explains, yes, Captain Leclerc, he died of apoplexy, something like that. But now we're here and we still have the entire cargo, all is well. He then has to do some ship things. And Monsieur Morel talks to Monsieur Danglars, who is the supercargo. Did I know what a supercargo was? No. And this is why it's really good when you read a classic from a different century to get yourself an edition that has notes. Because Robin Buss put a note in the back that explained that a supercargo is the person who's in charge of the cargo and the finances aboard. So he's not necessarily a sailor or a captain, but he is important. Now, Monsieur Danglars is a bit iffy already because Monsieur Morel is so impressed by Dantes, and he's like, well, if our old captain is dead, then perhaps this young man who seems so promising could be our new captain. And Danglars is like, maybe not. And he explains to Monsieur Morel that after the captain died, they had a mysterious visit on the Isle of Elba. Now, anyone who knows anything about what was happening in France around this time knows that there is a very special person on the island of Elba, and he is referred to as the Emperor. And this is, of course, Napoleon, who was recently defeated and is currently in his first little exile. Captain Leclerc wanted to stop off there, and we are told that Dantes received a packet of some sort while he was here. Or perhaps he delivered a packet, but then he maybe also got something back, and Monsieur Danglars is like, no, he definitely got a letter. And surely he's given you that letter, right, Monsieur Morel, if he's so trustworthy and great? And Morel is like, well, no, but I'm sure he will if it's important. Morel indicates to Dantes that he might promote him to captain, and Dantes is so excited, and he gets invited to dinner, but Dantes is like, no, I have to go visit my father. He's been without me for months, and I need to go check in on him. And Morel is like, well, aren't you just a very nice son? Go do that then. And so Dantes heads off through Marseille to visit his old father. And it's quite tragic, because his father is clearly old. He's also poor. He went through the money that Edmond left for him quite quickly, also because he was trying to be nice to other people. And then he had to lend money from a neighbor. And here we're introduced to another important character, Caderousse. He is a neighbor of old Dantes, and he is also a tailor. And he's the one who lent money to the old man. And of course he hears Edmond Dantes arrive, and he's like, hey, I would love my money back. And so Edmond does pay it back. And suddenly Caderousse is super lovely, and you can really tell that although Caderousse maybe isn't a bad person in and of himself, he is something of a fair weather friend. If all is good, he's good. If you're down on your luck, well, he might be gone. But Edmond Dantes has one other appointment to make, and he runs over to Les Catalans, which is described as a little village just outside of Marseille, which is part Moorish, part Spanish, and that is where Edmond Dantes' beloved Mercedes lives. And she's been waiting for him patiently, but she's not alone, because she also has I'm not entirely sure, is he her cousin? Some sort of cousin, I believe, definitely a family friend, but his name is Fernand, and we meet the two in Les Catalans as Fernand is once again pestering Mercedes to just marry him. He's like, surely Dantes drowned in the sea. Why are you still waiting for this man when I am here passionately in love with you? And there's definitely a little bit of a stereotype playing here as well about the beautiful Spanish woman and the fiery temper of a Spanish man. But Mercedes is like, I love you as a brother. Edmond is the one I love, though, and I will wait for him. And if he dies, I will die too. And then, of course, right in the middle of this heated conversation, Edmond walks in and the lovers are reunited and it's beautiful. And Fernand is so angry and so sad. And as the two lovers kind of go on a walk along the beachfront, he sort of stumbles away. And as Fernand is kind of on his way, grief-stricken, he walks past Le Réserve, which I think is a sort of restaurant place, and there Danglars, the supercargo of the ship, and Caderousse, the neighbor of the Dantes, are drinking. And they call him over and they sort of make fun of him a little bit. They're egging him on in his anger and in his frustration as well, especially when they then see Edmond and Mercedes walk towards them. And they're like, aren't you getting married? Aren't you already married? And they're like, no, we're getting married tomorrow, or we're getting betrothed rather tomorrow. Then Edmond has to go off to Paris because he has this really important letter to deliver. And then we're going to get married. And we're so excited. And Danglars is like, well, you'll be captain soon. Ha 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 ha. And the two walk away, the two lovers. And then these three men are still sat there. And the picture we sort of have here is that Caderousse is incredibly drunk. And again, he's not a man with strong loyalties except towards his own survival. Danglars is plotting. He does not want Edmond to be captain. And I think a lot of it, the way it is described, you can really tell that he's sort of jealous of this young man who seems to have everything going for him. And then, of course, there is Fernand, who is deep in love, he's desperate, and he just wants to somehow get the girl that he wants. So a plot is hatched. They sort of talk about, well, the political times and how easy it might be. This is mainly Danglars who does all of this. He's the mastermind behind it. How easy it could be to write a denunciation of someone as a Bonapartist and have them just locked up forever. Anyone who used to be loyal to Napoleon Bonaparte is under suspicion. And everyone who is currently loyal to Napoleon is definitely under suspicion. Fernand is like, well, how could you even do that? And then Danglars is like, well, let's hypothetically say, you know our shared good friend Edmond Dantes. Imagine that we wanted to denounce him. This is how we would do it. And he pulls out a piece of paper and a quill and he starts writing. And he's like, to make sure that this can never be traced back, hypothetically, you would write it with your left hand instead of your right hand. And so he writes out this whole denunciation. And then he's like, but of course we could never do this. And he sort of crumples it up and sort of throws it into a corner. making sure that Fernand sees this, and then he keeps getting Caderousse drunk, because although Caderousse is sort of useless, he's not the worst of people. So he's sort of like, but we couldn't do this. But Fernand has his eyes on this piece of paper, and so when Danglars drags Caderousse off to go home, Fernand grabs this piece of paper and heads into town with it. From there, we go straight into the beautiful betrothal scene between Edmond and Mercedes, and this also takes place at La Réserve, and is described in so much fun detail, and you just really feel like the love that those two share, how proud old Dantes is of his son, and how fond he is of Mercedes, and how Mercedes, like, she's so kind to Edmond's father as well, and it's so joyful. And then the police comes in and they drag Edmond away, and he's like, I have no idea what's happening, but it'll be fine, I'm sure. And that's the moment where Caderousse is like, wait up, remember that thing we were hypothetically doing yesterday? Does that have anything to do with this, Danglars? And Danglars is like, if you know what's good for you, you will forget whatever we've done. This is not our fault. We are not the ones who denounced him officially, so shh. Because of course Danglars has planned out all of this, and now Caderousse is also involved, and Fernand feels somewhat terrible, because while he was deep in his feelings yesterday, he can see how devastated Mercedes is and how devastated Edmond's father is, and he does feel a little bit guilty, I think. From this one betrothal that's just been ruined, we skip over, I was going to say ship, the boats are on my mind. We skip over to another betrothal feast, but this one is being celebrated among the elite of Marseille, who have always been loyal to the kings, who suffered under Napoleon, and now they're sort of regaining some of their old glory. And the people who are getting betrothed is Monsieur de Villefort, or Villefort, and Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran. He is the prosecutor of, or he's the assistant prosecutor of Marseille, and she is the daughter of French nobility. So this marriage is really good for de Villefort, because he can now advance his station in society, right? But during their betrothal feast, they sort of have these conversations and about, Napoleon and the king, and you sort of find out that de Villefort used to have a different name, but his father was a convinced ally of Bonaparte, and so he has distanced himself a little bit from his father by taking on a new name. Their betrothal feast is interrupted because someone knocks on the door and is like, we need the assistant prosecutor because the prosecutor is away, but we have a man who needs to be dealt with because he was just arrested. And his fiancée begs him like, oh, don't be cruel. On such a beautiful day, don't deliver a harsh sentence. And de Villefort's like, oh, I'll try, but, I've got to do my job. And so he heads off. And before he actually makes it to the police station, wherever they do this, the prosecutorial chambers, he is interrupted by Monsieur Morel, who, as we remember, hopefully, is Edmond Dantès' boss. He was also at the betrothal. He was going to make this young man his captain, and he tries to plead for clemency. And de Villefort is quite rude to Monsieur Morel and is like, I've got things to do. Leave me be. Then he enters his chambers and he is confronted with Edmond Dantès. And there's a lot of description which works really well to explain how honest and how good Edmond Dantès is. We really get a sense that this is just a young man who is currently, he's like on the peak of achieving everything a man could wish for at his stage in life, right? He's about to marry the love of his life. He's about to get a promotion, which means he'll be able to look after his father. And he's just a good, honest man. And this also impresses de Villefort. He thinks, what, my fiancé also did ask me to be nice, and this seems like a young man. Let's have a look at this denunciation. And Edmond is like, I don't recognize this. I don't recognize the handwriting either, but it has nothing to do with me. Yes, I was at the Isle of Elba. Yes, I did meet the emperor, but I'm not a Bonapartist. I was just trying to fulfill the last wishes of my captain, like a good sailor would. And de Villefort is wavering to be nice to him until, amongst his papers, he finds the letter which Edmond was meant to bring to Paris. And this letter is addressed to a Monsieur Noirtier, who lives in Paris. And de Villefort goes white. And the book literally describes it almost like a thunderbolt that hits him. And we come to realize that this Monsieur Noirtier is his father. And suddenly, de Villefort finds himself in a position where he's like, I'm trying to advance myself socially, but if everyone finds out that my father, although disgraced he may be, is in contact with the emperor, Jesus. And then he reads the letter and it's even worse. And we don't quite find out yet what the letter says, except that it's bad. And so Edmond Dantes is carried off to Chateau d'If. And the Villefort is still pretending like he just needs to go through a few bureaucratic loops and that this won't be forever. But nonetheless, Edmond Dantes ends up in Chateau d'If, which is a real castle which stands on a little island. So it's surrounded by water. The Villefort, meanwhile, heads to Paris, and we find out that what is in this letter is the announcement to his followers from Napoleon that he will indeed be leaving Elba and start the 100 Days. And these 100 days are sort of quite famous when Napoleon returns from Elba and just runs his way through France, right? Has all his loyal followers come back to him. And so Villefort goes to Paris, and it's actually quite fun because we get to meet the king, and the king is with his sort of ministers, and the ministers are like, no, like everything is fine. And then the Villefort comes in and he's like, everything is not fine. And then the Minister of War like leaves and he comes back and he's like, it's true. The emperor has landed. And all of that goes by quite quickly, but it's really nice. If ever there was a man who haunted the narrative, then it is Napoleon Bonaparte. He haunts most of the 19th century European classics. So at this point, we have Edmond Dantes in prison in Chateau d'If. And because he is a good, honest soul, he has no idea why he's there. He sort of loses his mind a little bit, and he's there for years until he finds out that maybe there is someone in a neighboring cell who is considered mad, who is an abbé, a monk, and they get in touch. And then he finds out why the monk is considered mad, because he keeps offering people insane amounts of money to let him out, because he's like, I've buried a treasure. And Edmond is like, okay, well, ignore that, but it's really nice to talk to a human being. So they are together for years, and Edmond has always been a good boy. He's a good sailor, he's a strong man, but he's not necessarily had access to a lot of education. And the Abbé Faria has learned throughout his entire life, and he has memorized a lot of books. So he educates Edmond. And at this point, I do also have to say, Edmond's goodness wavers a little bit. He, not necessarily because he becomes evil, but because the monk helps him put together how he ended up in prison. And he starts to realize that he's been set up and that actually the world isn't just currently unfair, but perhaps fundamentally cruel. And he insists upon vengeance. Now, what most people already know about the plot of The Count of Monte Cristo is that Edmond Dantes escapes from prison. The way he does so is fascinating. I was completely hooked. And he gets picked up because, again, Chateau d'If is surrounded by water, so he's swimming, and he gets picked up by some smugglers. Slowly but surely, he makes his way to the island of Monte Cristo. And there he starts looking for this treasure, which the monk has told him is there. And he does believe him. And he finds his treasure, and it is immense, it is enormous, and now Edmond Dantes has the means to gain revenge at hand. And then we get a little bit of a time jump, and suddenly we are introduced to some young men who are sort of French nobility, nouveau riche elite. And they encounter a number of very interesting people. One of them encounters Sinbad the sailor. And then when he's in Rome with his friend, he encounters the Count of Monte Cristo. And there is more smugglers, and there's bandits involved, and there's a massive festival, and maybe someone has to get rescued from the bandits. And when I first read this bit, I was like, what is going on here? Until I realized, we are setting up the coming revenge. Because we are currently in Italy, and I was like, isn't all the people that we want revenge on? Aren't they back in France? And apparently what I found out while reading the introduction to The Count of Monte Cristo is that they wanted to start the book with this episode in Italy, where we meet the Count of Monte Cristo as a mature man, who's, by the way, described as very attractive, and have him sort of go on this journey of vengeance. But it was actually requested that they start a little bit earlier. And I think that beginning part that I've just explained to you in more detail is so important to set up the various loyalties, the various conflicts, to get to meet all these people when they're a little bit younger and a little bit maybe dumber, and then meet them later when they're mature adults. And The way the revenge comes together is stunning. It takes like 900 pages for all of this vengeance, because by the time Edmond escapes prison, Chateau d'If, I think we're at page, let's say roughly 300, right? So there's ages to go, and then we spend a good couple of hundred pages in Italy just setting up the vibe, making contacts, and then I'd say the last maybe 500 or so pages, 600 maybe, that's when we're in Paris, when the revenge starts to unfold. And we know, of course, who needs to have vengeance rain down upon them, right? Caderousse, Danglars, and Fernand. And they are now all people who've somewhat established themselves. Perhaps they have families. And it is delightful to see how their lives are slowly taken apart in this search of vengeance, right? But what I also really like is that the Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes, he does not forget the people that were kind to him. And that is especially the family of Monsieur Morel. And there are these little hints, especially throughout the last third of the novel, where Dantes really has to sort of deal with the fact that there is love and there is kindness and there is hospitality and warmth in some of these people, and that maybe the sins of the fathers shouldn't be visited upon the sons and daughters, and how he sort of deals with that is quite interesting. I'm going to leave it there plot-wise, because otherwise we're never going to finish. I can see we're already at like half an hour. Well, it is a big book, so... The last thing I wanted to talk about is, my experiences and my favorite parts of this novel. So again, I wasn't expecting to read it as quickly as I did, because I read two big classics almost 10 years ago, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo and War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And those took me over half a year each, because I set myself this goal of like 10 chapters a week so that we get through it, but we also have other things to do. And I thought, well, I'll try the same in a more informal way with The Count of Monte Cristo. But, well, as I said at the beginning, I was projectless, so I had nothing to do, but I did have a week off. And so I really got stuck in. I started to really care about sort of Edmond and like what was happening with him. And then I was really intrigued by their time in prison. And then I was like, why are we in Italy? What are we doing? Who are these new people? And then I was like, oh my God, that is the Count of Monte Cristo. And, so it really sucked me in. And I think the serializing of this story has a lot to do with that, because it was written to keep people engaged, to keep them reading, to have them come back next week, next month, whenever the next installment would be, and read again and buy the newspaper in order to read it, right? So although I don't think the book was serialized in chapters, but probably more in chunks, there is nonetheless sort of a propulsive effect to it. And the way I explained it to friends was that this book, The Count of Monte Cristo, is immensely readable. It has elements of philosophy, especially when Edmond is learning things in prison. There's these big conversations about good and evil, but they don't drag on. Like, Alexandre Dumas doesn't get lost in these, and the conversations themselves aren't necessarily the focus. So a while back, I also read/listened to The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And the reason I listened to that is because I knew there were going to be endless discussions of philosophy and that those were part of the point of the book. And I knew at that time, it was during the start of the COVID pandemic, I knew I didn't have the brain space to read that, but I did have the brain space to listen to it if I had a good narrator. And I did. It was an excellent narrator. I can recommend it in the notes. But those philosophical conversations were part of the point of the book. As the reader, you were meant to be edified and informed by them and to make your own opinions, etc., about these philosophical thoughts. And that is not necessarily what's happening in the Count of Monte Cristo. I was going to say Mount of Monte Cristo. I need a coffee, apparently. But that's what I really like. The pace of it, how quickly it moves, and that Dumas manages to weave in all kinds of cultural references, philosophical elements, political, historical background, while keeping the plot really propulsive. And it's insane to say that a book that's almost 1,300 pages is propulsive and fast-paced, but it is. Like I see a lot of modern books and they, they have like 5, 6, 7, 800 pages. And my question is always like, is it that serious? I had that question with War and Peace as well. I didn't really enjoy War and Peace. And that's probably because I really loved Les Mis, which I read before. And then I read War and Peace and I was like, I do not care about these elite Russians and their problems. I hated, like, what's his name? Pierre, the Tolstoy stand-in as well. And I was like, this is not working out for me. But I loved everything about the Count of Monte Cristo. And that is also held by another favorite part of mine, which is the side characters. So, of course, Edmond Dantes is our protagonist. He is the Count of Monte Cristo. He has all kinds of aliases, and it's fascinating to watch this young boy / man sort of grow into this larger than life count figure who is compared to a vampire and to a bandit, and he's wealthier than you can imagine, right? And because of that change, there's a little bit of distance from the Count. We do get some insight into his thinking, but he's so focused on his mission and he is so rich that you are distanced from him a little bit. And so when you have other characters like the Morel family, but also Franz and Albert, the young French elite men that he meets, through them you get to see a different side of him, of the Count of Monte Cristo. And also they in and of themselves are interesting, and seeing how they respond to a man like this, but also how they move within their own Parisian, mostly, society. It makes it a lot of fun. And so every time the book detours away from just the Count of Monte Cristo himself to explain more of their lives or of the other people in France, and it never feels like it's unnecessary. And I think there's probably a larger conversation to be had about what people use the word like filler for these days, where everything that's not direct plot is considered filler, and firstly that's not how art works, I think, but I don't have to go into a rant about that today. But everything that is in these pages is relevant. So when I ask, is it that serious that it requires that many pages, the answer for the Count of Monte Cristo is yes. I will say, obviously, it is a story of its time. So the Count of Monte Cristo has spent a lot of time in the East, and there are definitely Orientalist aspects to this book. The way that it talks about, again, the Middle East, but also the Far East, it's quite stereotypical, it's all very lush, and the people are sort of excellent, maybe poisoners, but also slavers and murderers, and everything is a harem and everything is beautiful, so there's a lot of those stereotypes that come through, and you sort of have to read with them, not necessarily through or past them, but you have to see that what is being created here is a certain image, and you have to acknowledge that that does not align with the reality of the Middle or Far East, but that a certain image is being created. Similarly, there is discussion of slavery, physical violence, there is on-page executions, and of course there is revenge, which means that, people may or may not die, but that's definitely something you have to buy into. Yeah. I think I'm going to leave it there, mainly because I've been talking for so long. But those were some of my thoughts about the Count of Monte Cristo. If you ever want to read one of the big classics, I wholeheartedly recommend this one. And I now understand why I think a summer or so back, there was this massive let's read the Count of Monte Cristo together summer. Because it is incredibly fun to read. It must be incredibly fun to be able to talk about this with like a book club or just other people who are reading it at the same time. And if you get yourself an edition that has notes at the back, that also helps, but you can also read through those references if you don't fully get them. And yeah, I think the Count of Monte Cristo is a great time. I can totally see why it hasn't been out of print since it was first released. And I think everyone should read it. And this will give you an impression of why people love going back to the classics. If you're unsure about why some of these classics are classics, why they should still be read, if you go back to the Count of Monte Cristo and you see how much fun this is, how much knowledge is in there, the control that Alexandre Dumas has over his material, no clue is wasted, all the scene setting feeds into the whole experience of the novel. Like, if you give yourself over to it, you will see why we still love the classics. Not all of them. Another person who serialized much of their work is Charles Dickens, and I've still not been able to get around to reading one of his books properly. But maybe I will make myself this or next year. He's not a boogeyman. I don't have to be scared of him. All right. I think that's where we should stop for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.